Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medler Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hello and welcome to the Age of AI podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lamont, and today I'm joined by my Global Governance Institute colleague, Maya Sobchuk. Maya is a non-resident fellow in AI and global governance with the Global Governance Institute, and she is also a research fellow in the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo in Japan, where her research focuses on disinformation. Welcome to the show, Maya.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
It's really great to have you here, and let's dive straight away into our first question. Now, Russia's influence operations in Ukraine have been around for some time. Can you give our listeners some background on these operations, like what were their targets, what was their messaging, and how effective these campaigns were prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a great start. I think a lot of people think of Russian influence in Ukraine as a recent thing. As the world started to wake up to what was going on in Eastern Europe, they assumed that also the information campaigns began in 2022. But I would argue that this has actually been going on for centuries. Of course, technology has changed. Some narratives have changed now that the world is more connected. But in reality, this has been Ukraine's experience for a very long time. And so I think the historical angle is actually a very important component of information operations, and very important to understand if you're going to think about disinformation, how to fight it, and just how to win this war against Russia in general. So some of the main narratives that Russia uses that targeting Ukrainians is to convince them of their Russianness, actually, so that we're really not our own national identity, that we are just little Russians that have misbehaved and tried to do our own thing. The whole point is to wipe out nationalism and identity and assimilate and absorb into their broader empire. So influence operations from Russia are very broad. They're not just a propaganda poster that you now see maybe in a trendy hipster thrift store. They are Russian literature that tries to portray Ukrainians in a certain way. This great Russian soul that the whole world is familiar with because of the spread of their culture is also trying to convince people of a certain way and to think about Ukraine and the broader Russian empire in general. And so this dominance around the world means that Russia has the power to shape what the outside world thinks of its empire. And because of this proximate colonialism that Russia used, it wasn't the European style where they crossed an ocean to conquer someone that looks very different. Because we're so close to Russia, they were able to convince the world that they have jurisdiction over us and also jurisdiction over thoughts towards us. So that's where Russian propaganda stems from and the mentality behind Russian efforts in this area.
That's really fascinating. Two things there. One is that Russia or disinformation is not something new. It's been something that's been going on for centuries. Or is it also that disinformation is harnessing history and weaponizing history and national memory and identity, or both, in the case of Ukraine?
Yes, it's a very big component. And a lot of people, when they look at Ukraine, Russia from the outside, they forget this concept because a lot of the world thought of us as one for so long because that's what the Soviet Union convinced them of. And Russia is definitely weaponizing it in the modern age.
Fascinating. And going back also before the invasion, you mentioned in your recent commentary for the Global Governance Institute that Ukraine had a rich technological innovation scene that has since been repurposed for wartime needs. Can you tell us a little bit more about Ukraine's pre-invasion tech innovation landscape?
Yeah, so Ukraine actually had probably the strongest tech industry in Eastern Europe before the full-scale invasion. So when the full-scale invasion did happen, Ukraine was very well prepared to adapt to these wartime innovations that needed to be done. In plain and simple, Ukraine just has a lot of IT professionals. In the 2000s and even in the 90s, there were a lot of brain drain from Ukraine of software engineers and other IT professionals leaving, looking for opportunities elsewhere. But many stayed, and there's this now hub of innovation in Ukraine. There was already a culture before, is what I'm trying to emphasize. But unfortunately, when the full-scale invasion happened, about 70% of companies had to either move within the country or abroad. And almost 50% actually moved all or part of their operations abroad. And so you can see that this has caused a lot of problems within what was a very thriving sector within Ukraine. But nonetheless, Ukraine has adapted this tech savviness into what the current needs are, which is survival. And a lot of foreign tech companies also see that this is a very good place to invest, actually, because you can test product in a way that you can't test anywhere. Because Ukraine is fighting for survival, there's a very different mentality. You're not testing, really. You're just executing. You're trying to get things done. And that's why there's so much investment, especially in AI and in the tech sector more broadly.
And particularly at post-invasion, we saw a proliferation of a different kind of Russian influence operations from those that you introduced that were pre-invasion, particularly in the aftermath of the brutal conduct of the Russian armed forces and mass atrocities in places like Bucha. And here you saw atrocity denial, right? And social media and bots being harnessed in that role. How has AI played a role in documentation of war crimes and other international crimes committed by Russia's armed forces in the war in Ukraine?
AI is actually a very important part of prosecuting war crimes. So many people think of artificial intelligence in a very negative way. And sometimes in this media storm, it's to stir up views and to cause drama. Sometimes it's viewed in, AI is now killing people without human involvement. But in reality, especially when it comes to the information domain, AI is very important for defense because especially with this thing called OSINT, open source investigations, AI is able to dig through all of this video footage of all these atrocities. So in Bucha, a lot of these journalists used AI tools to detect what was going on and sift through so much footage and satellite imagery that would take decades if they were to just do it by hand. And so in reality, not only is this necessary for the legal process, but it also helps with even the psychological toll that these journalists have to face digging through these horrific war crimes. So in reality, it's necessary for defense.
Right, absolutely. And that's a function of the scale of digital evidence that has been produced during the war in Ukraine. And I guess I would assume, if I can ask, just to follow up on this particular question, you've also seen a lot of altered content as well. Has AI been harnessed in this content to help Ukrainians distinguish between what is real and what is not in digital spaces?
Yeah, I think in this particular case, despite what I just said, AI is definitely used in a negative. It's definitely more common for deepfakes to emerge rather than AI detecting the deepfakes.
Right.
I think sometimes there have been cases where AI actually hasn't been able to detect when an image was manipulated. So this is definitely an area that we will continue to see Ukraine developing and actually harness these booming tech sector, I think, to improve the technology.
This is going to be interesting. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions that will come up at a future date when you start seeing AI evidence being entered into evidence in war crimes trials, when accountability processes do eventually begin for a lot of these atrocities that you've talked about. That brings me to the next question. I think that if you go back to your commentary, you mentioned two really interesting startups. One is Google and the other is Mantis Analytics. And you mentioned these two as examples of Ukrainian tech startups that have harnessed AI to counter Russian disinformation specifically. It's getting back to what we were talking about in the previous question. Can you tell us more about these two firms and how they have leaned on AI to expose Russian disinformation campaigns?
Yes. So both of these firms have developed algorithms to track some of the narratives that Russia has put out about this war and seeing where those narratives are spreading, who it's affecting, where the reach is, and how popular some narratives are over others, which ones are taking off. So this is a very good example of this cross-sector collaboration, because even though these are private companies, their main client is the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government is trying to see what's being said and to counter it. These companies can't do it alone, and the government can't do it alone. And so it's necessary for this innovation to all these different parts of society to work together. So as disinformation researchers, we need this artificial intelligence, these algorithms to dig and track these certain narratives. Because again, like I said, with even the OSINT and the war crime investigation, it would take decades to go through every single post on Twitter that someone is saying and tracking it and seeing if it's a troll farm or not, if it's authentic or not. So this is definitely a necessary improvement. And another example where AI is actually a positive rather than the negative that it's sometimes framed to be.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned that in the context of investigations, that brings me back to something that you brought up just a few moments ago in relation to also the psychological toll that reviewing a lot of this footage where war crimes evidence can be found has on journalists and other investigators as well. And it reminded me of in the context of the United Nations Accountability Mission in Iraq, where a lot of ISIS evidence was being reviewed and a lot of it was digital, that this was having a psychological toll on those who were viewing this, and AI played a role in allowing a greater amount, an amount of footage that could never be looked at by a small team of investigators to be analyzed for evidence, but also to identify who is in these videos, like so identification of potentially like also perpetrators and whatnot, and has assisted trial processes. That's absolutely fascinating listening to you talk about these companies and how they have proven resilient in the aftermath of the invasion of 2022. And they've shifted to where the Ukrainian government is a major client and providing assistance in tracking disinformation. And that brings me to 2024, right, this year. What are the main themes, narratives, and messages that we are seeing in Russia's influence campaigns in Ukraine this year? It's been a particularly difficult one in terms of a temporary freeze in assistance from the U.S. that was only recently overcome in the U.S. Congress. Can you tell us what is the focus of disinformation going forward and now?
Yes. So Russia is definitely playing off of how long the war has gone on. No one is really thinking about it as much as they used to. Definitely, people are distracted by other events in the world. And so I think what Russia is really trying to do in the current moment is to let people forget. In addition to making sure that people aren't really talking about the war, they're also playing off of current events. So making sure that Russia is undermining the West and NATO in any way. They've successfully connected every fault of the West to the Ukrainian struggle for freedom somehow, even though Ukraine is an independent country. They're really loving this proxy war rhetoric, that this is really not Ukraine being a victim of Russia, but rather this is this great power struggle between Russia and the United States. In 2024, of course, much of this is around the Hamas-Israel war. They're really been given a lot to work with. There's been a lot of, the whole world is having a conversation about this every single day. And Russia has successfully created a false equivalency between these two wars, even though they have virtually nothing to do with each other. And so Russia has been really successful in this final push towards some of these countries that may have been neutral, or countries that were trying not to involve themselves with what was happening in Ukraine because it was so far away for them. But now they're saying, well, if you support maybe this one thing, then you should also think this way about Ukraine and what Russia is doing, and maybe forgetting about it.
How is Russia harnessing the Hamas-Israel war in the context of disinformation?
Yes. So it's interesting, the relationship between the United States and all of this, because obviously that is Russia's main enemy in this narrative that they're trying to spew. And they're comparing the United States actions in Ukraine with the United States actions in this Hamas-Israel war. And even though they're two completely different contexts, they're creating this double standard narrative. Rather than identify these third parties like the United States and criticize their actions, they're somehow tying Ukraine into this and saying that this is maybe not the fault of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, but rather maybe we should not support Ukraine as much and understand where Russia is coming from due to this double standard that the United States and maybe other Western countries have, even though it's a different continent, different context completely. And maybe the United States' motivations are different in different parts of the world. Somehow it's being weaponized against Ukraine, even though Ukraine is not the United States and it's an independent country that is just fighting for its survival.
And also Russia is no longer the Soviet Union, and some messaging that you see in parts of what are, for better or worse, described as the global South. Russia tries to play up that legacy of being identified with having supported a lot of struggles across the global South in the past in these countries themselves.
Yeah, this is where post-colonial theory is actually very interesting and how it's playing out here, because Ukraine is not seen by the global South as a colonized country. The Soviet Union isn't really included in the former Soviet Union is not included in this global map of the colonial. And I think Russia is really playing off of that in their narratives here in Israel Hamas, which is framed as this great war where global South is fighting against the global North, or whatever you want to call it. And Russia has really convinced everyone that because we look like them and we speak similar language, that they have jurisdiction over us in a way that maybe the global North doesn't have over global, or whatever framework you want to use. And it's very devastating as someone who's sitting from Ukraine that sees a lot more solidarity, for example, with the global South and wars that have happened there than maybe with the West. And so it's very interesting that now, because the West is supporting Ukraine, Russia has been able to create a false equivalency there.
Right. And of course, prior to the invasion, you had Ukraine being the place where a lot of students from around the world would have gone to and studied. In fact, many of those students from different parts of the world, like India, were caught up in the initial full-scale invasion back in 2022. So it's interesting that you mentioned those ties that Ukraine had. Now, one thing is interesting, so you went ahead of me here, because I was going to ask separately about Russia's messaging abroad, but also Russia's messaging within Ukraine. And when we started our discussion, you talked about how Russia's information campaigns tended to focus on emphasizing that, which we're talking about here also, what's being emphasized externally, is that Ukraine is not a autonomous or sovereign entity in the way that other states are. They're claiming this like historical nationalist identity-based authority over Ukraine. Is that the type of messaging that's continuing domestically, like to a Ukrainian audience through Russian disinformation in 2024? Or do you have other targets of disinformation or other kinds of themes and narratives within disinformation emerging?
From where I'm sitting, this war has been the single most unifying thing that Russia could have done to Ukraine. Definitely was the opposite effect that they had. I think some disinformation researchers in Ukraine disagree with that. And of course, there is debate among our community about how effective narratives are in convincing people. But this has created a very strong national identity where people, even after 2014, didn't really care about politics or maybe what was happening in the East or what language they spoke. Now, like, people are ashamed for speaking Russian. Women, that never happened before. People want this to emphasize their Ukrainian identity in a way that they never have before. Because when a missile is flying at your head, maybe a narrative isn't going to penetrate as deeply as that bullet is. So I think for me, and maybe this is because I am a Ukrainian that lives abroad, I'm really focused on how Russia is portraying it to the rest of the world. Right. Because this used to be a Ukraine versus Russia, very contained war. Now the entire world is involved and has their opinion really matters. And unfortunately, it has been successful in convincing countries, like I said in the previous question, that I think we should have more solidarity with, to look the other way and really just continue their perhaps economic ties with Russia over some moral likeness.
And being a researcher that is at the University of Tokyo, you see this in Japan as well?
Japan is a very interesting context because it's so different than the rest of the world. It feels so far from the rest of the world. And I think they equally don't think about other parts of the world, not just Ukraine, but also other parts. And so maybe Japan is not a fantastic example because it's across the board that they aren't thinking about these things.
Tell us more about the focus of your own research at the moment.
At the moment, I'm very interested in how Russia is framing this to the global South. I'm going to Latin America literally right after this podcast is filmed to try to understand how these narratives are playing out there in parts of the world where I think Ukraine, again, would have much more in common with. And it's very unfortunate that it's been framed this way. And I think because Russia has so much to work with there's a lot of anti-American sentiment. They've just been able to connect that to Ukraine, which honestly before this had nothing to do with the U.S. And it's unfortunate.
I guess what lessons then can be learned from Ukraine's experience for other countries in relation to countering Russian disinformation? So like, for example, you mentioned with Japan, it's a difficult example because there isn't that sensitivity to what's happening in places that are outside of Japan's borders, and especially those that are more far removed geographically. But broadly speaking, what lessons can be learned from Ukraine's experience?
I actually think it is a good idea to talk about Japan for this question, because it's countries like Japan that think disinformation isn't a problem. And as of this year and last year that has changed. In Japan, there has been a very dramatic shift, but it is a new concept here. And I think because, again, Japan has a different language than everyone else, they have a notion around them. They think that they're immune to this, but the information space is not physical. Being far away and having a different language is no longer something that protects your media ecosystem. I think also one thing that Ukraine can really show the rest of the world is this cross-sector collaboration against a common problem. Japan has sometimes a hard time coordinating even within its own government. And so I think for a threat I don't know if diverse is the right word, but I'm going to use the word diverse because it's such a multifaceted threat that comes from so many different angles. You need a very coordinated response amongst journalists, civil society, researchers, academia, and the private sector and the government. And without all of those components, you really can't create an effective counter. And that's something countries like Japan, but every country needs to learn as soon as possible, because Ukraine has had many years of experience that other countries don't have when they're faced with a similar problem.
And how do you think AI is going to play into the disinformation mix going forward? We talked about how it could be used as a tool against disinformation, right? In the context of the Ukrainian startups that we mentioned, a lot of what the Ukrainian government is trying to do. But you also hinted at, but there's certain aspects of AI that have more of a negative application so far than a positive, for example, deepfakes. What do you think some of the over-the-horizon threats might be in this space?
Well, of course, it's the scale. AI is just able to whip out narratives so quickly. And these infamous troll farms where Russia had to hire physical humans to type these comments on Facebook can now be automated. And so it's just a tsunami of propaganda that is coming at you rather than small waves pushed by a person. But also it makes the job easier almost in tracking them, because now you have tools. You don't need to know the historical context, for example, of the Soviet Union or of Japanese relations with China to track what is being said. You can identify that using software and then have humans that know what that means to translate that into effective solutions. So it's this double-edged sword and also double-edged solution to call it.
Right. And if you look at it from the perspective of those who are harnessing disinformation against an adversary, I think one of the concerns might be that if you flood the information space with so many things that aren't true, that people begin to distrust everything and demobilize from the political process. Do you see any of that yet?
That's definitely true. But I think Ukraine has done a good job of trying to push out the correct information as frequently and as accurately as possible. And before Russia is able to say what they're saying or someone is able to comment what they're saying. And if you hear it from a public official first and then the conversation on the internet follows, maybe you'll have that seed that will protect a little bit the truth. That's the hope.
That is a optimistic note to end on, in a sense, but also underlines the importance and urgency of engaging in conversations on disinformation, staying up to date with research and what the state of the art of disinformation is, and also looking at how new tools can be harnessed in this campaign to identify disinformation. Because as you said, if it's identified at an early stage and a public official comes out, even though its scale is massive and people might see it everywhere, you've already popped or burst the bubble of the effect that disinformation could have. So it seems that from that perspective, then the lesson of Ukraine is a certain degree of proactivity in identifying disinformation as it's coming out, because as you described it, you can describe it like a tsunami, that it's going to be such coming at you at such a massive scale that having public officials correct that narrative when it's still just emerging before it becomes something that is taken for granted and widely held belief among a population.
I think the important thing to remember is that time is the most crucial aspect of the fight against disinformation. Something Ukraine has definitely learned, but something that the entire world needs to grasp as soon as possible. And this is why we study emerging technologies and artificial intelligence's effect on the information space, because it affects most profoundly this aspect, time. It creates narratives much quicker. It also is able to fight them much quicker. And so this is where this smorgasbord of psychology and narratives and history all come together. And something Ukraine is definitely very good at fighting and offers many lessons to the rest of the world for.
Absolutely. The sense of speed has really changed, because it used to be that you had somebody create like what looked like a real website, but it was fake with a news story, and then you're waiting for people to share and disseminate it. Now, as you said, that's all automated.
Exactly.
Well, Maya, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I would like to also take this moment to thank our listeners for joining us again. As always, if you like the show, we invite you to subscribe and leave us a comment. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to join us for the next episode for a discussion at the intersection of AI and IR theory, law, and practice. Until then, stay human.